Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our authors joining us this evening. Charles C. Mann is the author of 1491, which won the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Keck Award for the Best Book of the Year. A correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly, Science, and Wired, he has covered the intersection of science, technology, and commerce for many newspapers and magazines here and abroad, including the New York Times, Vanity Fair, the Washington Post, and more. His other books include 1493 and The Wizard and the Prophet, two remarkable scientists and their dueling visions to shape tomorrow's world. Very glad that he's joining us this evening. Please welcome Charles C. Mann. Yay! And Annalee Newitz writes science fiction and nonfiction. They're the author of the novels The Future of Another Timeline and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. As a science journalist, they're a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and have a monthly column in New Scientist. They've published in the Washington Post, Slate, Popular Science, Ars Technica, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic, among others. They're also the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. Previously, they were the founder of IO9 and served as the editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. Their most recent book, Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, is the reason we are here this evening. Please join me in welcoming Annalee Newitz. Yay!
Yay!
Take it away, folks.
All right, it's so wonderful to be here. This is the book launch night, so it's really wonderful to be at my hometown bookstore, Green Apple. And I urge you to, if you aren't buying my book or you aren't buying one of Charles's books, buy another book. Just buy some books, you know, like anytime you can buy books at an independent bookstore, you're doing a good thing and supporting people who help bring books to the world. So, and Green Apple is particularly special and close to my heart. They were my local bookstore when I first moved to the city and lived in the Richmond. And it was, you know, it's this huge, tall, used bookstore, and it was lovely to hang out there and be among my people, which is to say, books. Also, you know, this is a virtual book tour. So, you know, Charles and I can't hear you or see you. And so there's none of the fun part of getting to like see people's expressions or like see them giggling and stuff like that. But the way that we're going to make up for that is that you're going to get to see one of the things that normally you don't see as an audience on a book tour, which is me hanging out with a friend and talking about my book. And, you know, if I were on book tour in real life, I would be definitely forcing Charles Mann to come out and have lunch with me or have coffee, and we would talk about our books and he would give me advice. And, you know, bless you for giving me all the advice that you did about this book. Holy crap. This book would not be what it is if I hadn't had lots of great conversations with Charles Mann and gotten his feedback. So thank you so much for being here to, you know, join the conversation. So what we're going to do, before I allow you to speak, Charles, you're on mute, I see. So I'm going to start by just reading a very short excerpt from the book, and then we're going to look at some pictures, and Charles and I are going to talk. And I should say that, as the title says, this is a book about 4 cities. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the oldest city, the first city in the book, Chateau which is in central Turkey. It's about a 9,000-year-old city, maybe even older than that, which makes it Neolithic, which means that when people were founding it, the highest form of technology they had was using rocks to you know, do as much work as they possibly could. And during the course of life at Chateau, they also developed other technologies like ceramics, which turns out ceramics is a pretty big deal. I'm also, I should just say, on my book tour this week, I'll be talking about the other 3 cities in the book on each successive night. So tomorrow I'm talking about Pompeii, and then I'll be talking about Cahokia on Thursday, and on Friday I'll be talking about Angkor. So if you want to collect them all, you can go to my website at annaleenewitz.com and find out more. All right, so imagine that you are on a bus in Turkey, going from a big, crowded, modern city called Konya into the countryside to see an ancient archaeological discovery. Or I should say the discovery is ancient. The archaeological part is actually a bit more recent. So let me show you, I'm going to do a little screen sharing here and give you a map of the city because it looks really cool. All right, so here is a map of Chaitalhoyook. This is a map that was designed by Jason Thompson, who's an incredibly talented artist who normally does Dungeons and Dragons maps. So that's why this looks so great. Well, in my opinion, because I love Dungeons and Dragons. Chaitalhoyook is a city built before cities existed. Most of it lies buried beneath the bulk of the East Mound, a low, wind-smoothed plateau. If you looked at it from above, the 13-hectare East Mound would form a kind of teardrop shape. Its contours are like an earthen blanket draped over the 9,000-year-old remains of a city whose inhabitants built houses atop houses for so long that the layers of clay brick construction formed a hill. Beyond the East Mound was the newer West Mound, a smaller neighborhood that formed about 8,500 years ago. When this city was young, rivers flowed around these city hills, and farms were scattered across the Konya Plain nearby. Today, the land is dry and covered in patches of yellowing grass. I sucked in a breath of warm, dusty air. This is where it all started, the world I knew, full of condos, factory farms, computers, and cities swarming with thousands of people, was born in places like this. Some archaeologists call Chaitalhoyook a mega site, or an outsized village where several smaller settlements merged. The city appears to have grown together organically, without any centralized planning or direction. Chaitalhoyook's architecture is unlike anything we see in the region thereafter. Each house was constructed like a cell in a honeycomb, pressed tightly against its neighbors, with almost no streets to separate them. The city grid was at least 1 story above the ground, and sidewalks wove across rooftops, with front doors cut into ceilings. Residents would have spent a lot of time on their roofs, cooking and crafting tools, often sleeping outside under light shelters. Simple wooden ladders helped residents climb up to the city and down into their homes. So you can see a little bit of that in the map that Jason has made. He's put little ladders in there to show you how people would have kind of gotten in and out. When the earliest construction began, many people coming to live at Chaitalhoyook were only a generation or two removed from nomadism. The idea of settling permanently in one place was revolutionary at the time. Though there were little villages before Chaitalhoyook, the vast majority of humans roved in small bands, just as their Paleolithic ancestors had done for over 100,000 years. Imagine leaving the natural world where your companions were only a few people and animals and embracing sedentary existence in a box crammed next to hundreds of other people in boxes. Your parents and grandparents, who knew only the old nomadic ways, couldn't possibly have prepared you for the weird complexities of urban life. It's no surprise that the people of Chaitalhoyook struggled to figure out the best way to live together and made many deadly mistakes along the way. This was perhaps the first time in human history when the question, "Where are you from?" came to matter as much as, "Who are your ancestors?" For a nomad who is always on the move, "Where are you from?" is difficult to answer. What matters is who your people are. That's why many ancient texts in the West, including the Bible, introduce their heroes with interminable lists of fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and so on. You are literally the sum of your ancestors. But when you live in one city your whole life, that place can become even more important to your sense of self than your family heritage. When people passed through one of Chaitalhoyook's thousands of rooftop doorways, they entered a new phase in human society. They found themselves in an alien future where people's identities were tied to a fixed location. The land was theirs, and they were part of the land. It would have been like a slow-motion shock, reverberating across generations. Survival now hinged on whether the climate was favorable for farming, and death could come any year from drought or flood. As we'll see in the story of this ancient city, settled life was so difficult that humans nearly decided to slam the door on urbanism forever. But we didn't. And that's what led me here, millennia later, to figure out what the hell our ancestors were doing. So that's a brief introduction to what the site is like. I can show you some pictures. Charles, do you want to, are you muted still?
No, I'm not.
So this is a picture, by the way, of this is on the East Mound. And this is the southern part of it, the dig house there. And so you can see we're kind of walking up a hill to get to the dig, and the dig is huge. You've been there, right? Yeah. It's enormous. Like, this is not normal, by the way. Like, when you go to an archaeological site, it's not usually in this like beautiful giant building, just full of people in their nice shade structure. Like, shade structures are super important to archaeologists, and this is a really great one. So this is a little bit of what it looks like.
The thing is, there's no streets. I mean, that's the incredible thing. It's like the entire city is a single giant apartment block that was all built higgledy-piggledy. It's absolutely unlike anything you see before, because normally you know where the important part of a city is.
Yeah, it's the street or it's the marketplace. And there's no marketplace. And this is one of the reasons why it was so weird for archaeologists from the West when they first started excavating in the early 1960s. They really didn't know what to make of it. Like, they thought maybe this was a giant temple. James Mellart, who was the first archaeologist to excavate, again in the early 1960s, kind of dug into part of one of the mounds and was like, holy crap, it must be a temple. It must be, he had a lot of crazy ideas about it. This picture I'm pausing on because you can see a little bit of the white plaster that people would have put on their walls. Here are a couple, here's a feature that I want to emphasize, which is that what you're looking at here are elevated platforms on one end of a house, and those holes are there because people buried their ancestors under their beds, under their bed platforms where they slept. And so this is where archaeologists have removed some human remains underneath the bed. And you see these everywhere, all over the city. There's some more of the plaster, and you can see a beautiful little bit of paint on top of it. People loved to paint abstract designs in red on their white plaster walls. Here is Ian Hodder, who ran the site for many, many years, and he's showing us all the layers of houses. So each of those little layers that you see, there's those blackened layers and then the lighter layers, that's layers of floors. So that's, houses are built on houses are built on houses here because people lived in this city for about 1,500 years. There's some more layers. And then this is another one of the dig structures that's even more insanely huge. This is really cool. Here's a closer view of some of the wall art that people had. And then this is one of the goddesses that we might want to talk about, who's not really a goddess. There's these figures are found everywhere at the site. And this is what we think it might have looked like in one of the houses when they were, being used. It's a reconstruction. So there's that bed platform. There'd be remains underneath it. And there's a wall, very famous wall painting from Chateau Hayook that some people think might be a map of the city with mountains in the background, but we don't really know. And there's another famous piece of art of two leopards from the site. And that's Konya Plain. And in the distance, this is the plain where the city was originally built. And in the distance, you can see Konya, the city, which is enormous. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute.
So Annalee, I just wanted to ask you, when I went there, I was completely floored by how strange the place was. It just didn't match any of my conceptions about what a city is like. There's no neighborhoods, there's no sidewalks, there's no streets, there's no markets, there's no communal spaces at all. And there's pathways. There doesn't even seem to be regular pathways. And then the houses are all just built on top of each other as I said, higgledy-piggledy. So there's
Yeah.
absolutely none of the kind of orientation that makes it possible for you to drive into a typical Western city and sort of say, oh, well, there's the, where the rich people live, and there's where the city hall, and there's none of that. And so the question is, this is a city that is so unlike what we have now that you have a whole discussion in your book about whether archaeologists arguing about whether to call it a city or not. And you have to wonder, if you ran the tape backwards and this happened again, is there anything necessary about the way we do cities? Could we have, if we ran the tape backwards and did it again, could we be all living in Chateau Hayoks?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. I mean, I think, and this is something that you and I have talked about a lot, because when you go back and look at these early cities, you sort of see an alternate history of urbanism, where what if we had continued to build cities without streets? Or one of the other really interesting aspects of Chaitalhoyook is that, as far as we can tell, most of the houses were the same size. They do have variation, of course. Some of them have 2 or 3 rooms, some of them only have 1 room, but there's no castles, there's no town hall, there's no what archaeologists like to call special use buildings, which are basically just any fancy building that's not for living in.
There's no monumental architecture at all.
No monumental architecture. And every house they've found, one of the big keys to thinking about how these houses work is that every space they found has a hearth in it, something you could use for cooking. So again, this suggests it's a place that someone lives in. It's not even if it's highly decorated and has lots of cool stuff in it, it's still a house. It's an abode. And so it raises all these questions about what the social structure was in a place like this. What is it like to live in a place where everyone has roughly the same thing? And again, this is the debate. Ian Hodder, who you saw explaining the layers, he believes that it had a relatively flat social structure and that it was kind of a communitarian place.
He calls it aggressively egalitarian.
Yes, then that's I think he's saying that because there is such a rigid adherence to this one type of house. It feels very aggressive. And I think that's the kind of road less traveled part of this, is what if we had cities where it was really egalitarian and nobody had a fancy Park Avenue loft or whatever. I don't even know if there's lofts on Park Avenue. You know what I mean?
But there's no gentrification, right? Because everybody's starting off in the same place, right? There's no way to take a low class apartment and upgrade it into it, because they're all the same.
That's right. Although until we start to see people moving from the East Mound to the West Mound, and that's something that happens, kind of toward the end of the life cycle of the city. People eventually kind of get sick of the East Mound, I think. And Ruth Tringham, who is one of the archaeologists I talk to a lot, and she's a big character in the book, she thinks that it was just that the hill got too big. People had just built on there for so long that doing everyday chores just became a pain in the ass, because you had to climb down the hill to get your water. You had to climb down the hill and climb back up the hill if you were doing any kind of crafting, or if you were getting clay to make new bricks for your house, or to make anything really. So she sort of half humorously proposed that, people were just like, no, I don't want to climb the hill. So they moved over to the west, which then of course also became a mound after people built on it for a while.
But it's a different mound though, because there you start to see some rich people's houses.
Right. And that's what's really important, is that you can see this evolution in the city where they've moved to this new place, and suddenly you start to see houses that are significantly larger. You start to see houses that have courtyards, which is quite interesting, very, very different from what's on the East Mound. And the reason why we're making such a big deal about East Mound versus West Mound is that people lived on the East Mound for about 1,000 years. This wasn't just they moved in and 50 years later they were like, bye-bye. This was a really, people really understood that this was a place that ancestors had lived, and had lived for a long time. And, we can see that the people who lived here appreciated history partly by observing a very interesting practice that we see here, which is people would bury their dead under the floor, but then they would excavate them and take out the skulls of presumably their beloved ancestors or friends, and they would plaster the skulls to recreate a face and paint them and put them out and put them on display, and then they would trade them back and forth. So your household might have the skull from another household. We have no idea why they did this. I don't think it was like a kind of, Magic the Gathering card trading thing. I don't think it was like that. I think it was something that had a bit more spiritual weight to it. Although, no, not to cast aspersions on the spiritual importance of Magic the Gathering, but
they also have these history houses too, which you talk about, and that is also something about a kind of a celebration. It seems to have been something about a celebration of the past. Maybe you should mention those. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, the skulls are kind of connected to history houses in a sense. So people would trade these skulls back and forth. And we know they traded them, like I said, because sometimes they rebury them. And so you'd find a skeleton from one person and a couple of skulls from other people. So that's how we know they traveled. And a history house was often a house. It's the closest we have to a special use house at Chateau. And these would be places that would often have tons of skulls in the floor, tons of burials, lots and lots of what archaeologists call elaboration, which means decorative elements. And these decorative elements, again, probably had spiritual connotations. They have a common decoration called Buchrania, which are plastered bull skulls. So kind of like those human skulls, but they're bull skulls. So they have big horns and they paint them red and they just look super badass. And sometimes people would have a ton of them, like 4 or 5 going up the wall. And they also would plant wild animal bones in the walls. So like not sticking out of the walls, but actually kind of plastered into them as if they were building with bones, with the bones of these wild creatures. And I think, again, that had some kind of spiritual significance, and that this was also part of feeling history, feeling connected to a place was putting these bones, putting these parts of bodies into these houses. And then by going into those houses, kind of re-experiencing history. And so, yeah, we know that people at Chateau were pretty freaking sophisticated. They were developing a notion of history. They were developing agriculture. They were developing a lot of technologies around ceramics and cooking. Cooking is a big deal, learning how to cook well and to cook lots of different stuff made life easier. And they actually had things like instant soup and things like that. So, which I won't go into, but you can learn more about that elsewhere. And yeah, so it was a very different kind of urbanism. And
there's another thing that we talked about in egalitarianism, which I think is really interesting, is that there's no obvious sign that women and men had a hierarchy. If there was a hierarchy, it doesn't seem to have been it wasn't about subjugation of women, which, geez, an awful lot of societies have been all about, right? And that to me is also really fascinating. You don't have an obvious upper crust ruling things. You don't even have an obvious religious upper crust, and you don't have men pushing around women. So in some ways, you think like, holy cow, this place is way more advanced than, say, 2021 Massachusetts, which is where I am now.
Yeah. And yeah. It's, again, it's important to understand where we get this idea that men and women were on a more equal footing. And there's a couple reasons why we think that. One is that those fancy skulls that people were passing around, there are relatively equal number of male and female skulls. So in other words, if those are honored ancestors, it's clear that people honored men and women on a relatively equal basis. Another reason why we think that women were probably on equal footing with men or close to that is because of these female figures that are found throughout the site, and indeed actually found throughout the region, those kind of older women with like large breasts and a large belly. When James Mellart first found those images, he thought they were fertility goddesses. Right. And now that's not really what archaeologists think anymore.
He also thought that not only was it it was not egalitarian because women were in charge. It was a matriarchy.
Right. He thought,
Right.
and it was funny because I think it was partly an artifact of the 1960s where he couldn't imagine equality between the sexes, but he could imagine like, well, maybe women were on top here. Like, and also I think because it struck him as so freaking weird that they had so many female figures. I'm going to pull up that female figure again, just so you guys can see it. Because the thing that struck Mellart was that, let's see if I can actually share this.
We should say that Mellart actually did amazing stuff. He was the guy who did the first excavation there, and he did a tremendous amount of very good things that later researchers have built on. It's just that this one thing got a lot of attention.
This is one of the figures that he found, and he did. I mean, Mellart, you know, he's the guy who kind of brought archaeology to Chaitalhoyook. He saw this female figure. Here he is. He's a guy living in the early 1960s. His experience of naked women as art would have been mostly women who were being sexualized. And he sees this picture, and this is a woman who looks fierce. She is a badass. She's got two freaking leopards next to her. Her face looks strong. Her body looks strong. She's big and tough, and she's on a throne. And he was like, whoa, what does that even mean? Like, how can a woman be naked and strong? It must be a matriarchy. I think that was probably what was going through his head, was he just didn't. And like I said, here's another one of these figures. This one was just found a couple of years ago. And it's now what archaeologists believe is that these were actually probably honored ancestors, that they weren't fertility figures, partly because if you look at this is a drawing that's from all sides. This is an older woman. You know, she doesn't look like she's in the prime of her fertility. She's older. She's, you know, her body is sagging. And so she may be kind of like these skulls that we were talking about. She might be a kind of honored elder. And so I think that's a really interesting new interpretation.
But also, again, sort of grist for the mill for the idea that this is a place without that kind of hierarchy. If she's an honored ancestor, a person you consulted, then, you know, that's radically different from what followed afterwards.
Sure is,
so
yeah.
Then you start to see in the West Mound, the emergence, starting to get some kind of emergence of hierarchy. And it seems like, you know, the science fiction writer in you must be thinking, like, what happens next, right? This is, you know, the hierarchy comes, and either it goes in one direction and becomes the super hierarchical societies that we see in Eurasia, or people say, no way, and they just take off. And it seems like, to me, Chateau Hoyok provides evidence for both of those.
Yeah, I think so. It definitely seems like people became disenchanted with the place around the time that the West Mound was really coming into its own. And
How long did it last?
So I think the West Mound, I'm going to say just a few hundred years.
So
it's short compared to, and people are living on both mounds for a while too. Yeah. And one of the ideas that was floated for a while, and I think now archaeologists are less excited about it, is that there was a moment when people were moving to the West Mound when there was a drought. And so there was this idea that, oh, maybe drought kind of mixed up their lives, but it doesn't seem like that happened. It doesn't seem like the drought drove people away. So it may just be what Ruth Tringham said, you know, people were just tired of walking up that hill. But as for the question of why they left, you know, they'd been there for a really long time. One theory is that they had this egalitarian system that just couldn't scale up. And so as more people came, it became harder and harder to engage in governance because there was no hierarchy. There was no representational democracy or anything. Like maybe there were councils or something, but we don't know. And so it may be that radically flat social structures work well if you're in a village, but once you're over 5,000 people, because at its height, Chateau had about 5,000
Right. So
people.
you end up with a Usenet problem.
Yeah, you end up, or the Wikipedia problem, or or like the Twitter problem. When I was at a conference at Chaitalhoyook many years ago, and they were talking about how sometimes you find like skull injuries that people had clearly recovered from. And so one theory is, I mean, everybody's going up and down ladders all the time, so they're probably falling and hitting their heads. But somebody was like, well, maybe they were throwing rocks at each other. You know, just a friendly rock. You know, but that, you know, it could have really led to a lot of personal conflicts that couldn't be resolved because there was no bigger structure for doing that. So before we go to audience questions, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about Göbekli Tepe, which is like the opposite of Chatal, but kind of feeds into it.
Yeah. So Göbekli Tepe, which I'd forgotten, it's actually indicated on your map. You have a sort of an arrow that says 600 kilometers.
Well, it's important because it's kind of the precursor in a way. So.
Well, it's both a precursor and another reminder that things didn't have to go the way that they did. Mm-hmm. It's, as far as we know, the oldest monumental architecture in the world, certainly the oldest that's known. It's in southern Turkey, not far from the border with Syria, southern central Turkey, and it's, well, maybe it's in the middle of nowhere. This is a reconstruction from National Geographic. They have these enormous rings, and they would build these patterns of 3 rings, filling them in each time, and then they buried the whole thing, and then they would build another one. And they did this at least 6 times. And one of the things that's here, you can see some of these things here. That's the overall pattern, and less than 1/10 of the site has been excavated. Excuse me.
Yeah.
It's really quite amazing. This is 12,000 years old. They're not really sure how much. And these two, all these bas reliefs, all these big T-shaped things are covered with bas reliefs of wild, scary animals. And it's also, like this one here, quite similar in that way to the decorations in Chateau Hoyok, where you have these wild animal bones embedded into the wall. And we have to remember, for these folks, the experience of being, you know, in a campfire with wolves outside, with scorpions and so forth, is very, very real. And so there's a sense somehow that this was a religious structure. And what's fascinating about it, in addition to the fact that it's 12,000 years old and has this incredibly sophisticated architecture and art, is that there's no real evidence at all so far that anybody lived here. It was a pilgrimage point, and it also had to have been a big collective gathering point just to build these things. These monoliths weigh, you know, up to 20 tons. And we don't have really any idea how they fed them, because this was before agriculture. And at the moment, they're sort of thinking this is the beginning of religion, and that religion is the reason that we began to involve in, you know, sort of intensified agriculture, which was to feed all the people that were necessary to construct these objects.
Yeah, and just to give even kind of a bigger context, the reason why we're talking about this is because it seems pretty clear that the culture at Chaitalhoyook grew out of the culture that created Göbekli Tepe. They're in the same region. As Charles is saying, it has some of the same iconography. And it's just, I think what's so interesting about it is one of the questions that archaeologists are constantly asking, and that I was constantly asking them, was which comes first, the farm or the city? And that's kind of what we use Göbekli Tepe to answer.
Yeah, and it seems like what came first was religion, you know, that there was a need for people to gather to worship, and that brings in the need to have feasts, lots of food. It brings in agriculture, and then you start to need to house all those people. And so, you know, what's fascinating to me is that there's a question that's in a lot of the human sciences. You know, are we just responding to things like climate, to the environment around it, or is there something in us that pushes us out? And this strongly suggests that the creations of the human mind are what propelled both belief, agriculture, urbanism, and the whole bit. And for whatever reason, it's really appealing to me.
Yeah, I love that. And I should add that I was very excited a couple of years ago when they discovered a plastered skull at the site of Göbekli Tepe. So just like the skulls that we see at Chaitalhoyook, except this one had some holes drilled in the top of the skull, which suggested that it had been basically hung on a rope and was kind of dangling from the ceiling, because those big round structures that you saw would have probably had a roof. And so things might have hung from them, or perhaps those skulls were hanging from some of these big T-shaped structures. Obviously, we don't know. But anyway, it's kind of spooky and it's kind of awesome. And I would say, to add to what you were saying about spirituality and religion causing our urge to build monumental structures, which I think lead to cities, we have to question what that was. Was it religion? Was it spirituality? Was it a sense of history? I think that's one of the most interesting things that I learned when writing about Chaitalhoyook, was that at its origin point, history and spirituality look really similar, because they're all about understanding our place in a larger cosmos. And that cosmos can be your family, your history, your ancestry. It can also involve the stars or the animals, or the whole world around you. But when we look at these artifacts, I kept seeing archaeologists having that debate, like, is it spiritual or is it history? Is it a history house or is it a temple? And I think we have to acknowledge that it's probably both. So this may not have been a church. This may have been more like a museum, a place that you came to understand where your people came from. So
or maybe our own distinction between church and museum is really not as useful as we might think it is.
Yes. Yeah. That's what's so delightful about studying these early cities, is you're like, wait a minute, do we need to separate spirituality and history? Or maybe we should be thinking about them as really part of the same thought process. It's, as you said, this imaginative urge to kind of place ourselves on the landscape.
And one of the other things that's united about them is that, just very briefly, and I think this speaks to our present day, is that both of these were cosmopolitan, in that these were large collections of people, and they had to have been of different groups of different languages and different ethnicities, because they drew so many people together from such a great distance. And the same thing I think is thought of Chateau Hoyok, is that it's a collection of people from all over the place. So at the very root of both of these enormous phenomena is this idea of multiple people from multiple places getting together. And again, the kind of idea we now have of a city belonging to one type of people, like Paris is for Parisians and so forth, is really different than what the origin of the urban impulse was.
Well, and also the reality is that Paris is not just for Parisians; it's also for North Africans, and it's also for Arabs,
but that is fundamental to its character as a city.
Yeah, and I think I'm so glad you brought that up. In fact, maybe I even stole this idea originally from you, which is that cities are for immigrants. They're built by immigrants. They're for immigrants. And that is written into the history of cities. And when I say written, it's built, I mean, the built environment reflects this. And yet Chaitalhoyook was absolutely a city of immigrants. And they, may have had separate neighborhoods. They may not have. They probably intermingled too. And and we see that right up through the present day. And so we have to kind of remember when people get stroppy about immigrants, what are you talking about? You're going against the tide of like 10,000 years of history. Like that's the way we build these places, is we have immigrants. So it's part of our urban culture. So we've got some questions. Should we go to the audience questions? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you both. Really also great questions here, folks. And I'm really excited by the two ideas that you have proposed, Annalee and Charles, of the idea of why are spirituality and history such separate things. I think they can definitely be conflated more. That's very exciting to me to think about. But onward. let's see. Stanny Holt has a question and also a comment that I think is relevant. Do we think there were intermediate stages towards urbanization between free roaming nomadism and the existing mounds, maybe smaller separate dwellings that gradually accumulated? And they also say, which I think is really interesting, the illustration makes Chaitalhoyook buildings look like apartment complexes in Foster City, near where I live.
Yes, Foster City, one of the greatest Neolithic developments of our time. Yeah, I'll pull it back up again just because why not? It'll be very exciting to see that picture again. Let's see. All right. Yeah, it's definitely, and I should say that this drawing is very idealized. Like one of the things that was emphasized to me over and over again is that parts of the city would have always been falling apart and in disrepair. And people, in fact, when they would move out of a house, their neighbors would often turn the house into a trash pit. So this place, I actually read a scientific paper on what it would have smelled like at Chaitalhoyook, and it was a long academic paper which wound up saying basically it would smell like poop. And like, in fact, one of the theories about how people lived there was that dogs lived there and ate a lot of the human poop, and that really helped. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, we can't know, but yeah, that would have been a big part of it. And then as for the question about were there kind of in-between stages, you know, it's funny. I think maybe, I mean, one of the things about cities is that they don't seem to be a gradual thing. People were living in villages. So, you know, there were nomads and there were people living in small villages, less than 200 people. I think the average size would have been more like 50 people. And these would have been year-round agricultural settlements. And, you know, people were living in those places and building Chaitalhoyook and being nomads all at the same time. Just like now, you know, there are still nomadic people now, there's still people in villages now, and there's people in cities and mega cities now. And so it doesn't seem like we kind of went through like a toddler stage and like a grown-up stage. It was something that seems to have emerged pretty quickly as part of a package with agriculture, basically, and also with some sense of kind of cosmological belonging, whether to a historical thing or to a spiritual thing. Is that kind of your sense,
it's like
Charles?
a bang, right? It's like, you know, it's really unprecedented so far as we know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there were other mega sites like Chateauhoyok, and I talk about one of them in the book. It's a little bit later, and there's some very disturbing details about it. And it seems like
the death pit.
The death pit. You'll find out if you read the book. The death pit. But it seems like one possibility is that Chaitalhoyook started out as a bunch of villages, and they just kind of eventually blooped up together. The technical term, you know, blooping together. So yeah, so it's possible that it was kind of a village and kind of a city at the same time.
Thank you. Bethany Brookshire asks, one, do we know why this rooftop honeycomb street-free kind of concept didn't persist? And two, do we know what the impetus was for large-scale settlements as opposed to smaller farming communities?
Hi, Bethany. Let's see. Charles, what do you think? You want to start this one?
You know, it's in a way, a big chunk of your book is why do people live in cities? You know, what is
that's true.
Impulse. So, I mean, and you know, the short answer is it's really hard to know because there's obvious drawbacks too to living in cities. You know, sanitation, people live shorter lives, and so forth. It was hard going up and down all those ladders. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's something really powerful and resonant I think in the human soul about this collection of people and seeing all these different people and the kind of urban life that must have been right there at the beginning when you're going over when you're going over these rooftops. There's all these other people living and doing stuff, and there's a whole lot of there's something very powerful about that. And you add that to the spiritual and historical resonance of all these people being together. And so it's clear that it has something to do with some kind of deep human psychology, I think. And that's a really weak, vague answer, but I think it's right.
I'm glad that you gave the weak, vague answer, because I would have said the same thing. And one of the amazing details that I kind of discovered in the process of doing this book is that every city that I looked at, and probably every city that's ever existed, had parties. And that was a good reason to go to the city, is they had really good parties. And we have evidence for these parties at Chaitalhoyook, where you see one of the key signs of a party is a big fire and half-eaten food. Mm-hmm. So if you're eating a bunch of barbecue and you like throw away bones that still have meat on them, clearly you're partying. And that's sort of how archaeologists, measure it. They'll say, like, we found this big pit of like stuff that was, clearly eaten by a big group of people all at once, and they weren't, kind of scraping the bones and using every little piece. So I think that's part of it. As for why they were attracted to that architecture, we don't know. There's a ton of theories. One theory is that it was cooler, it was easier to keep food that way. It kept, kind of created a distance between the people and the ground. But it's hard to say. It's easy to say why they didn't stick with it, because people fell down a lot. Like, we see a lot of injuries from people climbing up and down those ladders.
Well, one thing is it doesn't require you to maintain public space. Cities that we have now spend a huge amount of time fixing potholes, making sidewalks, doing mm-hmm. all that kind of stuff, which almost requires an urban government, to
Although you do have
maintenance. Here, you privatize all the maintenance, right?
Yeah, but you do have the problem. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You do have the problem of the fact that you and your neighbors share walls. So if your neighbor is a jerk and doesn't keep their wall nice, your wall could collapse. So there's no public space, but there's shared space. And that's one of the theories that archaeologists have, is that that's where all these conflicts would have come from, was people having these shared spaces and being like, why are you messing up my roof with your crappy wall,
Okay, question here from Mary Ellen Curtin, also known as Dr. Science on the Twitters. They say,
"Hi, Dr. Science."
The architecture looks a good deal like the Pueblos of the Southwest, another culture that is relatively egalitarian. Coincidence? What do Pueblo people think of Chaitalhoyook?
It does look sort of similar, for sure. It's not quite as elaborate. It's not as sophisticated as a lot of the Puebloan architecture that we see in the US. I mean, sophisticated is a relative term. All I mean is that it doesn't, these are made with like mud brick. They're not, super stable, long lasting. They usually only have 1 or 2 floors. But I don't know. I mean, I think, this is something that we're all trying to figure out, is how does architecture reflect social structure? And it could very well be that there's a connection between this kind of building and a more flat structure. On the other hand, if you look at, very authoritarian contemporary regimes, in the 20th century, like, there's nothing more recognizable than like a Soviet style apartment block. And is that egalitarian? I mean, maybe it's supposed to look egalitarian. It's a performance of egalitarianism, but of course it's the result of like extreme authoritarianism. So I don't know. It's hard to read too much into it.
So what Annalee hasn't told you is that before we were talking, we were actually talking about exactly this and irresponsibly speculating. And so Annalee gave you the correct actual answer, and I will take over the role of irresponsible speculation.
Yes.
So what you have in places like Chaco Canyon are obvious hierarchical structures, and they just, boom, they emerge out of what looks to have been previously pretty egalitarian, structures.
Chaco Canyon being the site of ancient Puebloan culture in New Mexico.
And these other sites like the Salmon ruins and the Aztec ruins and Mesa Verde. And you have these what they call great houses, which are like palaces or something. They're just enormous. They have hundreds of rooms. They have these gigantic kivas.
They're like 7 feet tall, and
Yeah,
I mean, not seven
the big,
stories tall, not 7 feet tall, 7 stories tall.
I think about, yeah, they're really quite remarkable. And there's been all these archaeological calculations of, how many, pack loads of 45 kilograms each would it take, to carry the maize from the Chusca Mountains, which are about 3 days away, and you end up with this enormous lot of bother to keep these places running. And what's fascinating to me is that people left, and after a while, and this is often presented in terms of they were abandoned. There's Jared Diamond writes about them collapsing and so forth. But if you talk to Pueblo people now, they say, well, they left and became us. We don't think of ourselves as like this degraded remnant. In fact, Pueblos lived in these fairly autonomous, and the village is the wrong word, they're Pueblos, which means town, but they're more like the Nawa Altopetl, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which is where you have the village and the surrounding countryside considered together as a unit. And they're both managed together by these sort of cooperative village councils. And so there you have, you can look at it as a story of people investigating what it's like to have a hierarchy and a social stratification and a bunch of rich guys up on top and saying, no way. This is obviously the kind of thing that gets lots of archaeologists scheming mad because we're going way ahead of leaning over our skis. But this is what we are irresponsibly speculating about, because you notice a similar sort of thing, which is that you look something that looks egalitarian on the East Mound, goes to hierarchy on the West Mound, and people say, nah, and leave. So
Yeah,
there's an echo of a pattern there.
And I mean, I love that story because, of course, I also don't really like extreme class division in my modern life. So yeah, that is a possibility for sure.
But
and I think it is speculation, but I think it's important to just emphasize the part that's not speculation, which is that the people who are alive today that can talk about it, can testify that like this is not a collapsed culture. This is just a culture that transformed. And as you said, we tried an experiment, didn't work out, and we moved on and made new kinds of cities. And I think that's exactly what happened at Chaitalhoyook, is that people were like, well, so kind of done with that. And people did in fact go back to village life, mostly to village life, for a couple thousand years before cities reemerge in Mesopotamia, and they look like the kind of classic cities of yore that we study in school, that have big ziggurats and giant monumental architecture and marketplaces and all that kind of stuff. And that also seems to kind of come out of nowhere too. All right, next question.
Thanks. We'll take probably 2 more for time's sake, but folks have really good questions, I'm just going to say, and unfortunately we can't get to all of them. This is from Lisa Kadlik, who asks, I'm fascinated by this practice of burying ancestors under the bed. Do we know of any similar practices seen in other places, and why under the bed specifically?
Yes, we do know that this was actually a pretty common Neolithic practice in the Levant area, which is kind of, that whole kind of Fertile Crescent zone. And there's some really, I think from Jericho, the city of Jericho, there's some famous plastered skulls that still have shells in the eyes. So that kind of gives us a hint of maybe how the skulls were decorated when they were plastered, that people really did try to recreate faces. The thing about burying them under the bed, burying the dead under the bed, it's so interesting to me. And I think that, there's many theories about why they did that. Part of the theory is that, again, this was a way of, laying claim to the space and kind of having a sense of it being your home because your ancestors are part of its built structure. The other thing is that part of the room in every house where those platforms are was clearly a special part of the house. Archaeologists sometimes call it the clean space because people would carefully maintain the walls in a very bright white So they would replaster those walls a lot. Like housekeeping in the Neolithic was actually a whole big deal because people were repainting like almost every month. And they'd be sweeping out all the time. And because, you're burning your hearth in there, right? So the walls are getting really smoky. So there was clearly some spiritual aspect to it, or some ritualistic aspect to it, where it was a part of the house that was very special. And I found myself wondering, here's the rank speculation. Archaeologists seem to have completely accepted that these platforms were beds. And I don't know why they think that, because maybe they weren't beds, maybe they were shrines and people were sleeping on the roof, or they were sleeping next to the hearth. We don't know. I mean, I think people have decided that they were beds just because they kind of look like beds, because they're tall and they're off the floor, and so they look like a Western idea of a bed. But either way, I think that it's part of what Charles and I have been talking about with kind of establishing like a spiritual or historical relationship with the place, and that the place is a body, and that is a body that is cosmic. It goes beyond life and death. And it's so cool. I don't know. Skulls are cool. We all like skulls. I don't know.
It's true. All right. Last question here for you folks is a more general one. Let's see. Okay. Which is more startling to contemplate? The fact that our prehistoric ancestors were nothing like us, or that they were almost identical to us?
I mean, why not both? I think it's always both, that there's a radical disjuncture between the present and the past that we have to respect. We have to respect how other the past is and not try to impose our modern ideas on it. But at the same time, like I said, they were partying, they were eating barbecue, they were painting, they were making, the same kinds of, they were making clothes, they were doing all kinds of stuff that we do now. So yeah, what do you think, Charles?
I think that's exactly right. That on the one hand, there are these things that seem to be present in every human culture. Bonds between people, bonds between parents and children. Great deal of concern about death. Great deal of concern about birth. Obviously, lots and lots of socializing, and then people have profoundly different ways of interpreting the world. And that's what makes it fascinating to try and get a little bit about archaeology. Is maybe you can get a little peek into the heads of these people who had these radically different ideas about their own place in the world and what that world was like.
Yeah, it's like traveling to a secondary world in fantasy, where, there's recognizable bits, and then there's just parts that we may never understand. Like we really may never know some of the answers to these incredibly good questions about, like, why did you bury people under your bed? Was that your bed? We're not even sure if that was your bed. And
why
I love that.
A city? Right.
Yeah, exactly. Did this feel like a city to you? So yeah, I think that's one of the things that I love about archaeology, and kind of what makes it more of a humanities kind of thing rather than a science, which is that there's a lot of ambiguity, and you just have to suck it up and live with it. Live with the ambiguity.
Thank you both for your insight and speculation, and the time that you have spent with us here. I really appreciate it. This was really fun hearing you folks talk about it.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks so much for having us. It was so nice to see you, Charles.
Nice to see you, Annalee. Let's hope after vaccination we can get together in person.
Yes, that would be great.
Next time we can do this, we can see all of you great people as well in person.
Yeah, that would be nice. Also, hi, Diana. I know Diana's out there.
Thanks, folks. And also, don't forget to pick up Annalee's book. It is out now. It is out today. I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't remind you that it is available for purchase with signed special postcards that are available here at Green Apple. It looks exactly like that.
And it has that map that you were looking at. Jason Thompson created maps of all the cities, so it has these beautiful maps, and something that I was really excited about.
Plus, there are 3 other cities.
Yes, exactly. So if you're interested in Pompeii, I'll be at Watermark Books with Brad DeLong tomorrow night talking about Pompeii and economics.
Very cool. Thank you both so much, and thank you all for joining us this evening, and we will surely see you soon.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.